I'm Zeynep Coşkun, a research fellow at Sharq Forum. Today I have with me Mohamed Okda, who is an economist and political risk analyst and the founder of Insight into Crisis Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Okda. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
We're in Istanbul now for our conference, Envisioning a Post-Crisis Regional Order in the MENA region. We have been here yesterday with panel sessions, and today we have roundtable workshops, and we're going to finish off the conference today. It has been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, thank you. I'm very happy to be here again with the Sharq Forum. It's always informative, always essential to be here to meet colleagues and interact with them and see how the future, or what the future holds for us in relation to all the crises that's going on in the Middle East, and particularly that we envision going into a long-term crisis period in our history.
Mr. Okda, today let's talk with you about the socio-economic drivers of the crises in the region, and where do you see those what do you see those drivers as in the region, the socio-economic drivers of the crises in the region?
I believe the first one is the lack of the rule of law. If we look at a country like Egypt, there's basically no rule of law right now being applied in Egypt. A very corrupt judicial system, a very corrupt police system, and that has a very negative effect on investment, particularly local investment. And it's creating an outflow of cash from Egypt to more secure places like the Gulf areas, particularly the UAE and Europe, and also in America. If we establish a better rule of law in Egypt, we can see a better outflow of foreign direct investment and local investment. The other one is transparency. Egypt ranked very low on transparency and ranks very high in corruption. I think the last report of Transparency International, they ranked number 88 on the transparency as compared to other countries. The first Arab country that ranked higher is Qatar, and it's number 22, and UAE number 23. So we can see the big gap between these countries. And transparency and accountability in general is a main driver, again, for the trust of the investment community in an economy, and they can bring more. Another issue, which is a major issue, and this is across the Middle East, not just in Egypt, is the lack of access to finance. 37% of companies in the region say that their number one issue is the lack of finance. They cannot get enough financing. And if we look at bank financing in Egypt, we can see that over 90% of business loans goes to only less than 1% of clients in a country like Egypt. And if you are in a small or a medium-sized business, getting bank financing is almost impossible. And if we look even at the data, we can see that in a country like Egypt, only 7% of businesses have access to bank finances as compared to 18% globally. Capital market is even low in Egypt. Capital market is about 4% in financing new ventures. And as a small business, you need to have the ecosystem for innovation and creativity, and part of that ecosystem is the availability of finance and the appetite for risk, and there's just no appetite for risk, for example, for entrepreneurship ventures or for innovation and technology. And we see very few funds, venture capital fund that is willing to invest into issues like that. The other one is, when I go back to the corruption issue, we can see in a country like Egypt, in a country like Syria before the war, in a country like Algeria, the control of the elite and in particular the military on the economic issues.
I actually want to ask you about that especially in Egypt, military is the major consolidated economic actor. And how does it affect, the military being the main economic actor in the country, how does it affect the economy of Egypt? Also, how does it affect the crisis in Egypt?
Well, the first thing in the economy in Egypt, the average estimate we have is about 40%, that the military controls about 40%. And these data is coming from top business community leaders who interact with the military, and it can go as high as 60%. The problem with the military is, again, is the transparency and accountability. There are many business and many companies that they control, and they are outside of the state budget. We don't have any valid information about them, how they do business. The other thing is, and when we look at accountability, there's a very loose licensing system and monitoring system. So other state institutions have no power over them. When it comes to taxes, they don't pay taxes. When it comes to labor, they use what I like to call slave labor. Basically, conscripts of the military are working over there, and they pay almost or very little or almost no power bills, and they get that free. And if you look at the business, if let us say a construction company or a factory that produces tomato sauce or cookies, which the military does in Egypt and sell to the public, how a private sector company can compete with that? They have to pay taxes, they have to pay premium wages, they have to pay power bill, and they can't really compete with the military. So this is already eroding the competition system, which is the basis of a free enterprise market. And when you look at new investment, people try to avoid investing in areas controlled by the military, and on the long term, that erodes the quality and erodes the trust in the society vis-a-vis the military and vis-a-vis the government.
And like now, taking from there, the military being the major actor and people not being able to compete again because there's no fair market. How does it affect the nature of trade? Because I'm thinking that if we take from there that the nature of trade would go heavier on the military needs, so going towards more on military trade than anything else.
That is true. I mean, if we look at the imports of Egypt, most of it goes through the military. We recently had a crisis about the supply of infant formula across the country, and immediately the military said intervene and start buying it overseas and providing it as they say, at cheaper price. This is not the role of the military. The role of the military is to secure the borders and not go into enterprising businesses. And that creates a parallel market. There is a parallel market in Egypt for energy, for consumer goods that is coming out of the military. And again, it's a taxation issue. They don't pay enough custom, they don't pay enough taxes. And
I think they also get the dollar cheaper on the borders, so they have some currency.
Absolutely. In the last few days, we can see there is a big push from the IMF for Egypt to liberalize the currency, to float the currency, and not having two parallel markets for the currency between the official rate and the market rate. I think this will be a positive step in the long term, but in the short term it's going to have a very negative effect on inflation and on the consumer price index and on the ability of the Egyptian poor to buy food and important necessary goods.
And if we think about this dominance of the Egyptian military in the markets, in this parallel market, can we also talk about this creates an illegal economy because people cannot fight against the military in the regular markets? Like there's no, so like how does that create, I mean, does that actually create an illegal economy in Egypt?
Well, I believe that military economy is by definition an illegal economy. And so if we look at the lowest estimate that they control 40% of the Egyptian economy, that by itself is an illegal economy, basically just because they are not paying enough taxes on it or no taxes on it. There is no accountability when it comes to licensing. If they're dealing with food, let us say the health department or the health officials, either local or national, they cannot really enforce the health code. There is many violations in the construction business that's being done by the military and the road constructions and so on. So by definition, it's an illegal market. And if we look at the country like Egypt right now, one of the major economic issues is a deficit in the budget, and the deficit in the budget can only be fulfilled by taxes. But if the government itself, if the military itself is not paying enough taxes, we're going to keep seeing this deficit going higher and higher as we go. But and if we look at the parallel market, recently Egypt added the value-added tax and start enforcing that. And if you look, most of the small and medium-sized businesses, they made their cost analysis based on paying very little tax, and now it has to be enforced for the value-added tax, and the cost of enforcing that and accounting for that is going to be very high on the small businesses and medium-sized businesses, that many of them are folding out now and closing the shops simply because they cannot spend time into paying the taxes. And then when we look on the other side, we have military-owned businesses and military-allied businesses that is just not paying enough taxes.
And like to finish off, bring it all together, this heavy involvement of the military in active economy also suggests that they have a heavy hand in planning the economy. So can you talk a little bit, like finish it off with, like what are the problems with fiscal and monetary planning in Egypt?
In Egypt in particular, and I'm smiling about that, I would say there were some kind of a monetary policy up to a year ago. But since the appointment of the current governor of the central bank, the monetary policies have been very erratic. And there's no plan, there's just no strategy. And when you look at the macroeconomic policies, particularly when it comes to currency, a country can do one of two things, can either fight inflation or stabilize the price of the currency. And Egypt have been trying to do both, and thus consumed most of their foreign currency and just stabilizing the currency, the Egyptian pound, over the last 4 or 5 years, and thus spending, I think, over $50 billion into just stabilizing the pound, while the job should have been fighting inflation and floating the pound, gradually. But again, looking at the monetary policy, there's an extreme lack of vision for the monetary policy in Egypt, and I don't think the IMF coming policies are going to be easy to enforce, and is going to create more unrest and more crises in Egypt. Particularly on people who are under or around the poverty level. I expect at least 12% more people are going to go into under the poverty level in Egypt in the next 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. Okda, for this insightful conversation. And as your institution suggests, you really have given an insight into crisis. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.